Blood doesn't just bind families, sometimes it poisons them. On a quiet summer evening, police stormed a small home on the edge of town. Inside, they froze. A teenage girl lay slumped in a pool of blood, her swollen belly still. Just feet away, an older man, her own grandfather, shot dead where he sat, and holding the gun, his chest heaving, was her father. He looked the officers dead in the eye and said 7 words they'll never forget. "He took my daughter. I took them both." But how did love turn into something so twisted it would destroy 3 generations in one night? Welcome to True Crimes Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would stay buried. Blood doesn't just bind families, sometimes it poisons them. On a quiet August evening, the air in East Haven was still, heavy with heat, until the sound of gunshots split it open. Police sirens screamed down the narrow street, red and blue lights bouncing off cracked sidewalks and rusted fences. Neighbors stood frozen on porches, whispering, clutching each other, trying to understand what had just happened in the little greenhouse at the end of the block. Inside, 2 bodies lay sprawled in grotesque stillness. A teenage girl no more than 17, her swollen belly a cruel sign of the life inside her, was crumpled against the wall, her eyes wide but unseeing. Just feet away, an older man's lifeless body bled into the carpet, his face twisted in shock, his chest torn open by bullets. Standing over them, a tall, broad-shouldered black man gripped a pistol in both hands, his knuckles pale against the black metal. Sweat ran down his temples, his breathing was ragged, but his eyes were steady. He turned slowly toward the officers as if he had been expecting them, and spoke in a voice so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "He took my daughter. I took them both." They cuffed him without resistance, but his gaze never wavered. Not from the bodies, not from the blood, not from the weight of what he had done. People would ask for months why a man would shoot his own father and his only child in the same breath. The answer wasn't born in that moment, it had been growing for years. Years of wounds that didn't bleed, betrayals that didn't heal, and a twisted chain of choices that dragged 3 generations to their violent end. Leonard Price was born in 1964 on the south side of Greenwood City, the first son of a woman who scrubbed floors for a living and a man who never stayed long enough to see the sun rise. By 15, he had learned 2 truths: charm could open almost any door, and women were the easiest way to get what you wanted. Leonard had the kind of smile that could talk a preacher into skipping church, the kind of voice that made promises sound like destiny. By the time he was 20, he was known in every bar, pool hall, and corner store as the man who could get a woman to give him her last dollar just for another night of his attention. But charm was a cheap currency. It bought him drinks, nights in strange beds, and whispers in the neighborhood, but it didn't buy him respect. That didn't bother Leonard. Respect was slow. Leonard liked fast women, fast money, fast escapes when the trouble caught up. In 1982, he met Lorraine, a church girl with a laugh that came from deep in her belly and a heart too big for her own good. She was the kind who thought she could fix a man if she just loved him enough. Leonard married her within 6 months, not because he was in love, but because she was steady and he needed steady. A year later, their first and only child, Elijah, was born. Fatherhood didn't slow Leonard down. He still vanished for nights, sometimes weeks, leaving Lorraine to explain to Elijah why his daddy wasn't home. The boy learned early not to wait at the window. When Elijah was 8, Lorraine had enough. She packed a bag, took Elijah's hand, and walked out, but Leonard wasn't the kind of man you could erase. He drifted in and out of Elijah's life like a shadow, never there when you needed him, always showing up when you didn't. Elijah grew into a man by watching the kind of man he didn't want to be. He swore he'd never cheat, never leave, never treat his family like something disposable. He worked his way through trade school, became an electrician, and at 24 married Marcia, a teacher with eyes like midnight and a patience that steadied him. For 10 years, they built a life together, raising their daughter Nyla in a small 2-bedroom on the west side. Then the marriage cracked. Marcia left one winter, saying she was tired of living with a man who worked more hours than he talked. Elijah got custody of Nyla. She was only 7. He became both father and mother, working during the day, cooking and helping with homework at night. By 14, Nyla was tall, sharp-featured, with a beauty that made strangers look twice. She had her father's stubbornness but her mother's softness, though that softness started to fade when she realized how much they struggled. Then Leonard reappeared. It had been almost 3 years since Elijah had seen his father, and now here he was, grinning on their porch with a crisp button-down shirt and a gold watch that caught the sun. He said he wanted to make things right, that he wanted to be part of Nyla's life. Elijah didn't trust him, but Nyla's eyes lit up at the idea of a grandfather. Leonard started visiting every week, bringing small gifts, bracelets, shoes, a cell phone Elijah couldn't afford. Nyla laughed more when he was around. Elijah told himself it was harmless. Maybe the old man was finally trying to do right. He didn't see the way Leonard's eyes lingered too long when Nyla smiled, or how his compliments slid just a shade past what a grandfather should say. At least, not yet. Leonard had a way of making himself indispensable without ever really earning it. Within months, he'd woven himself into Nyla's daily life, driving her to school when Elijah was stuck at a job site, slipping her $20 bills just for fun, and showing up at her basketball games with flowers. Elijah noticed, but he told himself it was good for Nyla to feel supported. She'd lost enough already when her mother left. The neighbors started talking first. Little comments dropped like pebbles. How nice it was that Leonard and Nyla were so close. How she seemed to light up when he came around. How she dressed up a little more on days he visited. Elijah brushed it off, but something about it stayed lodged in the back of his mind. Then came the night Leonard offered to take Nyla out for dinner to celebrate her 16th birthday. Elijah couldn't get off work, so he agreed, grateful someone was making the night special for her. They didn't get home until almost midnight. Nyla floated through the door wearing a new necklace, her cheeks flushed like she'd been running. Leonard's grin was too wide, too satisfied. Elijah asked where they'd gone, and Leonard listed a fancy downtown restaurant he'd never taken Elijah to in his life. "She deserves the best," Leonard said, resting a hand on her shoulder a beat too long. It was subtle, but Elijah felt it. In the weeks that followed, Nyla began confiding in Leonard more than her father. Elijah would overhear them laughing in the kitchen late at night, voices low, the kind of laughter you share over secrets. When Elijah walked in, they'd stop, glancing at each other like they'd been caught. He told himself it was just generational distance, that Nyla saw him as strict and Leonard as fun, but deep down, unease was curling in his gut. One Saturday in early spring, Elijah came home from a job to find Nyla gone. She hadn't said where she was going, but Leonard's car was missing too. They returned hours later, Leonard dropping her at the curb with a wink before driving off. Nyla hurried inside, avoiding her father's eyes. "Where were you?" Elijah asked. "Just out," she said, retreating to her room. Her phone stayed glued to her hand the rest of the night. It got worse when Leonard started buying her clothes Elijah would never approve of, short skirts, low-cut tops, and Nyla wore them like armor. When Elijah confronted him, Leonard laughed it off. "She's growing up, son. Let her feel beautiful." Elijah wanted to believe it was harmless, but the memory of his father's life, how he moved through women like they were seasons, kept scraping at him. By the time summer came, Nyla was spending more nights at Leonard's apartment than at home. She claimed she liked the quiet there, that he let her have her own space. Elijah told her to come home more often, but she always found a reason to stay away. And then came the morning she stumbled into the kitchen, pale and shaky, with dark circles under her eyes. She barely touched her breakfast. Elijah asked if she was okay, and she mumbled something about feeling sick before disappearing into the bathroom. He stood there staring at her untouched plate, the pit in his stomach turning to stone. Something was wrong. He just didn't know yet how deep it went. Over the next 2 weeks, the sickness didn't go away. Nyla skipped school twice, blaming a stubborn stomach bug, but Elijah could see it was more than that. Her skin looked paler, her energy drained, and she moved through the house like someone carrying a weight she couldn't put down. She stopped eating full meals, picking at food and then pushing it away. She wore oversized hoodies even though the heat in August felt like it was melting the city. When she walked past him, he noticed the faint scent of perfume she'd never worn before. She barely looked him in the eye anymore. If her phone buzzed, she would grab it so quickly you'd think it was going to explode in her hands. One night, while she was in the shower, Elijah walked into the bathroom to grab a towel from the cabinet. Her phone sat on the counter, face down, the screen still glowing from a recent notification. He didn't mean to look, but his eyes caught the name on the lock screen, Lenny. Only one person in their lives went by that name. The preview of the message was enough to make his chest tighten. You need to tell him before someone else does. Elijah stared at the words, the steam from the shower curling around him like smoke. His pulse thudded in his ears. He stepped back, gripping the edge of the sink to keep from barging into the shower and demanding answers right then and there. When Nyla came out, towel wrapped around her, damp hair clinging to her cheeks, she avoided his gaze. She scurried past him, muttering something about finishing homework. Elijah stood in the doorway watching her go, his jaw tight. He wanted to ask, but part of him already feared the answer. The next day, Elijah left work early and drove across town to Leonard's apartment. He didn't bother calling ahead. He knew if he gave either of them a warning, whatever was happening would be hidden before he could see it. When he got there, the door was unlocked. He stepped inside and froze. Nyla's sneakers were by the couch, and her backpack sat on the floor like she lived there. In the kitchen, she sat at the table wearing one of Leonard's t-shirts, sipping juice from a glass while flipping through a magazine. Leonard stood beside her, leaning on the counter, grinning at something she had just said. They both looked up when they saw him. Nyla's face drained of color, and Leonard's grin shifted, slowly, into something harder, sharper, almost challenging. "What's going on here?" Elijah asked. His voice was low but tight, like a cord about to snap. Leonard spread his hands in mock innocence. "She's family, son. I'm just taking care of her." His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent to it, like he was daring Elijah to push further. Nyla glanced at Elijah, then away just as quickly. Her cheeks flushed. She didn't speak. Elijah's eyes darted between them, his mind reeling, but the words wouldn't come. He left without answering, walking out the door and down the hall, the stale apartment air clinging to him like something he couldn't shake. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every visit, every gift, every strange smile over the past year. By morning, he had almost convinced himself he was imagining it, until the following week, when Nyla sat him down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the glass of water in front of her. "Dad, I have to tell you something," she whispered. Elijah leaned forward, the unease in his chest tightening into a fist. "I'm pregnant." The words seemed to echo around the kitchen, too heavy to belong in such a small space. He stared at her, his voice cracking when he finally managed, "Who?" Nyla's eyes welled up, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. For a long moment she said nothing, and then, barely louder than a breath, she said, "Granddad." Elijah's hands curled into fists on the table. The air felt thick, every breath sharp like glass in his lungs. She was crying now, shoulders shaking, her face crumpled with shame. And in that moment, something deep inside him began to split apart. Elijah didn't move. His body was locked in place, but inside something was grinding apart, a slow, brutal breaking that he could almost hear. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, thick with a silence that pressed down on him like weight. The clock above the fridge ticked louder than it ever had before, each second slamming into his ears like a hammer. He kept his eyes on her, waiting for some sign that he had misheard, that his mind had twisted her words into something they weren't. He forced his voice out, low and strained. "Say it again." Nyla's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, her voice barely more than a tremor. "Granddad." Elijah's stomach turned so hard it made him feel dizzy. His chair scraped against the tile as he stood, the sound sharp and jarring. He took a step back, then another, the kitchen suddenly feeling too small to hold them both. For a fleeting moment, he thought about walking out the front door, about breathing air that wasn't poisoned by what he'd just heard. Maybe if he left now, the world outside would still feel normal. But normal was gone. Elijah's mind raced back over every moment that had seemed off: Leonard buying her clothes she had no business wearing, the late-night whispers in the kitchen, the way she seemed lighter after coming back from his place. All the red flags he had buried under excuses, all the warnings he had convinced himself were paranoia. They weren't. They were the truth knocking at his door the whole time, and now it had kicked the door in. He told me he loved me, Nyla blurted suddenly, her words tumbling over each other in a rush. He said you wouldn't understand. He said we were meant to be. His voice was raw, ragged, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. That man is your grandfather. Nyla's tears spilled faster, rolling down her cheeks as she shook her head. You don't know him like I do. He listens. He makes me feel like I matter. He's not what you think. Elijah's vision swam. In his mind, Leonard's face appeared, the smirk he wore when he knew he was in control, the slow way he leaned against counters like the world owed him something. Elijah had seen that expression his entire life. It was how Leonard looked at women right before he pulled them in. And now, he had turned it on his own granddaughter. Elijah's hands curled into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make her see the reality she was too deep inside to recognize. But all he could do was stand there, heat roaring through his chest, every heartbeat louder than the last. Where is he? Said you'd try to ruin what we have. Elijah let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl, a sound that made Nyla flinch. He turned away from her before he did something he couldn't take back. He walked down the hall to his room, each step feeling heavier than the last, the walls closing in like they were trying to swallow him. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he stared at the blank wall in front of him. His breathing was deep and uneven, his mind running in a vicious loop, rage, shame, disbelief, back to rage again. There was no misunderstanding this. Leonard had crossed a line you didn't come back from. And Nyla, whether she truly understood it or not, had chosen to stand right there with him. In that moment, Elijah knew something in him had shifted for good. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew this, whatever came next, there would be no forgiveness. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark, his hands resting on his knees, his mind trapped in an endless replay of Nyla's tear-streaked face and Leonard's smug grin. By morning, his decision had hardened into something solid, something that left no room for second thoughts. He went to work like normal, but instead of heading home afterward, he drove past the hardware store and picked up a small, locked case from the trunk of his car. Inside was a pistol he'd bought years ago for protection and hoped he'd never need. That evening, he cleaned it slowly, his movements calm, methodical, almost surgical. There was no rush. He wanted everything ready. 2 days later, Leonard called him, bold enough to gloat. "She's with me now, son. You had your chance to be the man in her life, and you blew it." Elijah said nothing, letting the words settle in his bones like poison. The next afternoon, he saw them together. Leonard and Nyla walking down the street, her hand hooked through his arm, laughing at something he'd said. Strangers would have thought they were lovers. Elijah didn't look away. He didn't hide. Leonard saw him and smirked. That was the final cut. On a humid Friday night, Elijah drove to Leonard's apartment. The door was unlocked, like the old man believed he was untouchable. Inside, Leonard sat on the couch, one arm draped across the backrest, Nyla curled against him. The swell of her belly was impossible to miss now. Elijah stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the floor. Nyla looked up first. "Dad," she started, but her voice faltered when she saw the gun in his hand. Leonard's smirk stayed. "You ain't gonna do nothing," he said, leaning back like it was a game. Elijah raised the gun without a word and fired. The first bullet caught Leonard in the chest, snapping his body back against the couch. The second tore into his shoulder. He gasped, his eyes wide in shock for the first time Elijah could remember. Neela screamed, scrambling to her feet, but Elijah's gaze was locked on his father. One more shot to the head silenced him for good. The room reeked of gunpowder and blood. Nyla's sobs filled the silence, her hands outstretched as if she could make him stop. "Please, Dad. Please, don't." Elijah's voice broke as he cut her off. "You chose him." The gun went off again. The bullet hit her square in the chest. She stumbled, her eyes wide, then crumpled to the floor. Her hands twitched toward her stomach before going still. Elijah stood there, breathing hard, the weapon hanging at his side. Outside, someone was screaming for help, and sirens began to wail in the distance. When the police burst through the door, they found him exactly where he'd been, staring down at the two bodies. An officer shouted for him to drop the gun. Elijah obeyed slowly, placing it on the coffee table, then looking up with eyes that were cold and empty. "He took my daughter." "I took them both," he said, his voice steady. The trial was quick but messy. Prosecutors called it a double execution, painting Elijah as a man who let pride turn into slaughter. The defense spoke of betrayal, manipulation, and the slow destruction of a family from the inside out. Witnesses whispered about Leonard's behavior, about how the relationship between him and Nyla was wrong from the start. None of it changed the outcome. Elijah was convicted of 2 counts of homicide and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 40 years. He didn't cry when the verdict was read. He didn't flinch when they put the cuffs back on. As he was led away, a reporter called out, asking if he had any last words for the people watching. He paused, turned slightly, and said, "Tell them not to wait until it's too late." This story is one that will split people down the middle. Was Elijah a cold-blooded killer who crossed the line, or was he a broken man pushed beyond his breaking point? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this again.